Good afternoon. My name is Alison, and I'm the president of the International Federation of Translators. And I speak to you today from Eastern Australia, from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to be here with you this afternoon. And I'd like to just share with you some thoughts about the need for NGOs to factor language provision and access into the work that they do in order to successfully deliver the decades. So I'll just share my screen with you. So before I start, I'd just like to say a word about FIT. FIT is the International Federation that represents professional associations of translators, interpreters, and terminologists, and advocates for the profession. Now, there are, of course, many aspects to our work, but one of them is the promotion of the need for professional translation and interpreting to support multilingualism, linguistic access to services, and multilateral dialogue as a pathway to lasting peace. And when I talk about translation today, I'm referring to both the written and the spoken, that is, to translation and interpreting, and also terminology. Now, translation plays a key political and cultural role in multilateralism and multiculturalism. And why do NGOs need to factor translation into their work? Well, translating and interpreting can support their work, increasing their reach and effectiveness through dissemination of the organization's research and work and its ideas to the widest possible audience. Now, translation and interpreting also provides access and mitigates exclusion, particularly in Indigenous and minority languages. Translators and interpreters allow participation because for many people, to participate in their language of proficiency requires using a translator or interpreter. Now, language rights, which are the right to use your own language as an integral expression of your identity and your agency, are part of the human rights agenda. Linguistic rights are fundamental human rights because they allow access to the other important rights, such as health, justice, education, and freedom of expression. So considering language access becomes essential, but sadly, there's no one size fits all. Unlike the larger institutions, such as the European Parliament or the UN, who have their translation policies and processes well in hand, smaller NGOs often have less formal, more response-driven and ad hoc approaches to translation. They often don't have internal language teams that they can depend on, and they have very varying needs, different funding models, different geographical realities, for example, and the languages that you need will always depend on where you operate and how widely you operate. So while many NGOs understand and acknowledge the importance and the practice of inclusiveness, diversity, and also multilingual access, they are not always aware of how translation can help them to achieve it. Without a formal translation policy, it's often harder to delineate responsibilities. Now, on things such as who translates, who is expected to provide the translation, what languages are needed, and also for what purpose. What kind of texts and use cases are you thinking about? You also want to know who can take ownership of the final work. That also involves issues around things like intellectual property and also responsibility for any eventual liability. And I'd just like to touch on those three main areas around the answers to those questions in regard to Indigenous language translating and interpreting. Now, the first of those is technology, community, and professionals. When NGOs need to disseminate information and services in multiple languages, it's often at speed and with a limited budget. Now, there's a tendency to think that the ability to use technology will be a quick and easy solution to the problem, or perhaps to use community-based approach such as crowdsourcing or volunteer translation, because it'll save you money, right? Well, sometimes the cost-effective solution has a hidden cost. That is, for example, look here, this is a classic historic MT disaster. And equally, a crowd that loves your work and may be unfamiliar with some of your terminology or objectives could reframe your message and get it wrong. Now, these are shortcomings to these solutions. There's many, such as the inaccuracy that can be put into the message, ownership of information and confidentiality, reputation, or even the gender and racial bias that's often inherent in technological systems. And technology can get in the way, not just in MT, but in many different areas. Indigenous languages can be poorly served by a technological approach. And that's because things like machine translation is based on data, and data is a numbers game, and many Indigenous languages may lack sufficient data. In addition, cultures whose knowledge is tied to nature and passed down through stories and rituals and family rather than text will have less data available. Their language base, their knowledge base, and even their ecological base don't always transfer easily into a database. And the second thing to look at is education. Now, there's a need for education of service providers in how to and when to use translating and interpreting with Indigenous languages, but also to educate and train more translators and interpreters in minority languages. Traditional training courses generally offer majority languages, although this is changing. There's many associations and institutions now that are beginning to train, to provide training in Indigenous languages, and this is expanding. But often, NGO and their services don't have specific training for staff on working with Indigenous languages and cultures, which can be exclusionary. Educating people on using translating and interpreting is important and can make a huge difference to the outcomes of projects. Now, in the pandemic, a US hospital found that patients who had limited English language proficiency had, through no fault of their own, a 35% higher chance of dying, which basically made languages other than English a health risk. And that was because there was no access to an interpreter or translated information to support patients, which could have made a huge difference. So there's a real need to help identify and train more translators and interpreters in order to meet the rapidly growing demand. And one of the reasons that demand is growing is due to one of the big factors that's putting pressure on every aspect of our society today, and that's climate. Climate has a huge effect on migration. With changes in climate come changes in migration flows, both external and internal. And there's really very little awareness sometimes of the presence of Indigenous language speakers who have limited proficiency in other languages. For example, there's an increasing number of Indigenous language speakers arriving in the US from the South, and they're often identified based on their country of origin rather than from their Indigenous culture. And this has resulted in them as being classified as Spanish speakers, which many of them are not. In fact, they struggle to make themselves understood and to understand in Spanish. Indigenous languages provide intergenerational transfer of intangible cultural heritage and historic knowledge, and that will help us in facing these future global climate challenges. So accessing this knowledge is crucial and often requires the deep understanding a translator and interpreter can offer. Now, the global development agenda depends on a wide range of factors, such as economic growth, sustainability, security, health, human rights, and environmental protection. And their successful delivery depends on equitable access, both to information and to services. And it also depends on a dialogue with communities and genuine engagement and lasting relationships. So the role of translators and interpreters and terminologists in this cannot be underestimated. Global multilingual institutions and NGOs must recognize the importance of language in achieving their aims and design coherent and sustainable linguistic policies very early on to help plan for those overarching language management and needs, and to also facilitate access. Because effective use of translation enables community inclusion and empowerment by providing both the access to the information and services that's needed and a way for a community and its members to be heard. Thank you. I hope, I wish you well on your journey throughout the decade, and I hope that this has given you an idea of some of the factors to consider around language provision and access. Thank you.